Life on Earth is carbon-based. Before life began, CO2 was 70% of the atmosphere. Now it's fallen 99.9% to just 0.004%. This is because every year for the last 3.5 billion years, living organisms have died, fallen to the ground or seabed, and every year a small quantity of carbon gets buried and fossilized, permanently removing it from the biosphere. Here in the UK, the White Cliffs of Dover are just one small example, being the fossilized remains of countless trillions of planktonic algae that died millions of years ago, creating layers of organic sedimentary rock on the seabed and permanently removing carbon from the biosphere. This table, from the Encyclopaedia Britannica, shows the current distribution of carbon on Earth. The first entry shows that 99.9% of all carbon has now been absorbed into the rocks of the lithosphere. Nearly all carbon has now been removed from the biosphere in an ongoing process that continues to this day, and one day life on Earth will end when carbon falls to a level where photosynthesis stops working, which is around 150 parts per million. Only we can prevent this happening by restoring fossilized carbon back into the biosphere, which we've been doing successfully for about 100 years now in a process that has boosted life and made us very prosperous. But now dark forces are trying to reverse this and destroy life. This photo shows a carbon capture plant in Iceland that removes carbon from the atmosphere and converts it into solid rock that is then buried underground, permanently removing enough carbon every year equivalent to that needed for 700,000 humans. This is a death cult on a previously unimaginable scale. This graph was obtained from ice cores drilled at the Domesday Ice Station in Antarctica about 20 years ago and is a continuous record of the Earth's climate over the last 800,000 years. It shows that we are locked in an ice age that is interrupted every 100,000 years by a short interglacial period. This confirms a brilliant piece of work by the Serbian scientist Milutin Milankovic, who, in the 1920s, found that interglacial periods were a consequence of variations in both the Earth's orbit and its axial tilt. In particular, he found that every 100,000 years the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun during its closest approach, creating an exceptional warm period that melts most of the northern ice sheet, creating a warm interglacial period. The red line shows atmospheric CO2 and was measured directly from air bubbles trapped within the ice. It shows CO2 regularly falling to just 180 parts per million as a result of being absorbed into the cooling oceans and then recovering during interglacial periods. The black line shows the temperature and was obtained from the amount of heavy water contained in the ice. The oceans naturally contain a small quantity of heavy water which requires a higher temperature to evaporate. The higher the temperature, the more heavy water is found in the ice. This clearly shows that both the temperature and CO2 are currently higher because we've been in an interglacial period now for 10,000 years, which could end any time now. When it does, the temperature will plunge 9 degrees centigrade and CO2 will fall to around 180 parts per million, destroying most life on Earth for another 90,000 years. The northern hemisphere is significant because it mostly comprises land capable of supporting a massive ice sheet that reflects sunlight to keep the planet frozen, whereas the southern hemisphere is mostly ocean that constrains the ice sheet. The Earth's present orbit and orientation no longer support the conditions to warm the northern hemisphere, and it now only needs a single trigger event, like a large volcanic eruption, to plunge us into the next deadly glaciation period. This will likely trigger nuclear war as nations in the northern hemisphere, like the UK and Russia, fight over an impossibly small habitable land area. Those countries without nuclear weapons, like Canada, Sweden etc., will just die. We could probably prevent this from happening by warming the planet and melting the entire northern ice sheet in advance, but we are, of course, currently participating in a massive death cult today doing the exact opposite. Actions we should be taking include burning every scrap of fossil fuel to boost atmospheric CO2, deliberately releasing methane into the atmosphere, building a massive fleet of space mirrors to divert sunlight to warm the northern hemisphere, and building a fleet of submerged nuclear power stations beneath the ice sheet. These could manufacture hydrogen from water using electrolysis while their waste heat melts the ice sheet from beneath. Increasing CO2 boosts life. This can clearly be seen in this satellite image from Boston University showing the change in planetary greening between 1982 and 2015 as a result of our restoring carbon to the atmosphere. This now brings us to the big lie being told by climate activists. This is slide number 7 of 69 slides produced by the United Nations to help teachers make our children anxious in order to trick them into joining their death cult. On the left it shows the sun warming the planet, while on the right it shows the greenhouse effect, where infrared radiation from the Earth is returned back causing warming. But this diagram totally excludes infrared energy emitted by the sun. About half of the sun's output is also infrared that interacts with greenhouse gases in the atmosphere in exactly the same way, but returning some of the sun's infrared radiation back into space and causing solar cooling. But this huge infrared component of the sun is not shown on this slide because it causes cooling. It has been deliberately omitted by the climate change movement to trick our children into joining their death cult. It is the biggest lie ever told in human history. Atmospheric CO2 has the ability to warm the coldest parts of our planet, the polar regions, while also cooling the hottest parts in the tropics, both at the same time. It does this by returning some infrared energy back to where it came from. When that infrared originates from Earth, it's returned causing warming. But when it originates from the sun and gets returned back into space, it causes solar cooling. Since the tropics get most sunlight and the poles hardly any, this means the tropics receive more cooling than the poles. You might imagine that, since the tropics are warmer, they emit more infrared than the poles, causing more warming. This is true, but infrared emissions are due to the Earth's absolute temperature, measured in degrees Kelvin, which means infrared from the tropics is only about 20% greater than from the poles. The overall effect is to warm the poles without overheating the tropics. This is exactly what we need. It will warm the colder parts of the Earth like the northern ice sheet without overheating the tropics. This is just one of many similar diagrams that have been used for decades to trick people into believing carbon is bad. Here in the UK, the Met Office, the BBC and many others have produced similar diagrams, while NASA and others have done the same in the United States. This has now created a huge worldwide death cult committed to removing carbon and freezing the planet. This is how life on Earth will end. The only remaining question is when.